Hello and welcome to CAN TV Conversations. I'm Irene Chang. Today we're talking about how the Chicago chapter of the Asian American Journalists Association supports its AAPI members as they report on anti-Asian hate crimes. Joining me is Taylor Moore, a freelance journalist who has written for media outlets such as The Guardian, Vice, and Chicago Reader. Taylor is also a member of the AAJA Chicago chapter. Taylor, welcome and thanks so much for being here today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so tell me about AAJA as a national organization. What is the mission of the organization?
Yeah, so the Asian American Journalists Association is a national organization that focuses on supporting Asian American and Pacific Islander journalists through programming, through student scholarships, through our national conference. Really the AAJA's mission is to bolster fair and nuanced coverage of communities of color and also increase newsroom diversity.
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah, so how does the national organization work together with the region-specific AAJA Chicago chapter? Because there are like different regions, like for San Francisco, New York, Chicago. So how does it work with the Chicago chapter?
Yeah, so AAJA National really does provide the infrastructure for membership, provides benefits unto itself. I'd say the local chapters, their role is to provide regional specific programming for members. We have relationships with AAPI journalists across the city. We really know what issues are affecting journalists in newsrooms in our city. So we can really tailor our programming and our scholarships and our partnerships by being a local chapter.
Okay, yeah. So let's talk more about how AAPI journalists in the Chicagoland area are doing, especially given the spike in anti-Asian incidents. How does AAJA Chicago support its members?
Yeah, so after the March 25th 5 shootings in Atlanta, in which a white gunman ended up killing 8 people, including 6 Asian women, we were just devastated on a personal level. As Asian American and Pacific Islander journalists who also, may have experienced discrimination or racism in the newsroom and in our personal lives. So we were really moved to try to do something about it. And then, these incidents of violence aren't new. This has been going on, since the start of the spread of coronavirus, in which the COVID-19 was often called the China virus, and that led to a spike in anti-Asian violence across the country. And then just the history of anti-Asian violence, goes back further before former President Donald Trump and before there's just centuries of ways that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have variously been oppressed in American society. So going back to your original question, so in the days after the March 25 shootings, we really wanted to try to get out the word about resources to help journalists cover this anti-Asian violence, because we were noticing that a lot of coverage was missing key components of historical context, and was really, for example, due to the nature of the shooting, there were many news outlets that were not addressing the long history of the hypersexualization of Asian women that contributed to this particular violence that happened in spas. And we noticed that many newsrooms were kind of taking the Atlanta police's word for it that the gunman was motivated by a sexual addiction, and that the gunman may have been having a bad day, which really trivializes the murders of these women, and also trivializes the grief and the trauma that Asian Americans may be feeling around this. So, for example, when National released its resources like a guide to covering anti-Asian violence. We boosted that on social media. They released a pronunciation guide to make sure that names were pronounced correctly, the victims. We boosted that. We also came up with our own guide of local resources, like media contacts for Asian American Asian American organizations that could specifically speak to anti-Asian violence in the city, mental health resources for journalists who may be, wanting to talk through how this may be affecting them, and then we also in April we held a group session where we really just had want to create a forum and a safe space for Asian American and Pacific Islander journalists to talk through what they've experienced personally, professionally, in their work life, to, I guess, find solace in each other's experiences. And when, for example, like some journalists may feel like they're being ignored or tokenized in their newsrooms, or felt like the assignments covering anti-Asian violence weren't being written about sensitively. So, and then this is not something that's specific to Asian American journalists. It's also something that affects Black journalists and Latino journalists and Native journalists. So this is really speaks to a wider culture in journalism of really prioritizing white journalist voices and ignoring the structural barriers that journalists of color may face in the newsroom and out in the field.
Right, yes. Thank you so much for that very nice, long, detailed explanation. And so you kind of covered this a little bit, but also in light of the anti-Asian hate crimes that we've been talking about, the shooting, and just all of the little incidents that are happening, what is one of the main issues facing AAPI journalists right now?
Yeah, I think what I've been hearing from Asian journalists and colleagues is really just a fatigue around how their newsroom managers, their editors may be handling coverage of Asian Americans. For example, they may use insensitive language in stories. They may not even cover anti-Asian violence at all, which, that speaks to something that in journalism of the idea of objectivity and of being neutral. And we found that there are journalists who are Asian American, not necessarily in Chicago, but around the country, who may feel that, whose managers may feel that they can't actually cover these issues because it may be too personal or they may be biased. When really, Asian American journalists, in my opinion, are honestly the most well-equipped to be telling these stories, because they can provide that cultural context and sensitivity that would be required in covering something so traumatic to people.
Right, right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Taylor, for coming on today. I had such a lovely conversation with you, and I would have loved to continue talking about it, but we're a little short on time. So thank you again, Taylor, for joining us today to have this very important discussion.
Of course, thank you for having me.